my understanding of sort of recreational drugs in general is that a come down is where you sit below that equilibrium for longer because
Yeah.
you've gone so aggressively below. So to put it into sort of realistic terms, obviously it's a much more aggressively spiked in one direction and then the other with that sort of thing when it comes to synthetic drug use. But
Hmm.
it's the same mechanism, isn't it? In terms of day to day human interaction in our brain, it's the same thing
Hmm.
happening.
Exactly the same thing happening. And a recent discovery that I've been really researching, and there's a chap called Andrew Huberman, you may have heard of him. He's kind of becoming the king in neuroscience now. There's this whole concept that when you're below baseline in dopamine, you're not going to feel that good. Really low dopamine, you're going to be looking at things like depression, experiencing really low mood. That depression, from the neurobiological perspective, when you can't be bothered to do anything, can't be bothered to get out of bed, can't bother to eat, all of these kind of things, you're low in that driving energy, that driving dopamine chemical. So typically, I've always been looking down this narrative of you don't want to be below baseline dopamine because low dopamine is not going to feel good. Your brain also has an additional chemical when you're going below baseline called dynorphin. When you go below baseline, dynorphin releases into the system, which actually gives additional psychological pain, mental stress, anxiety, whatever it may be, as a mechanism to try and reinforce something wasn't right with what you just did to me there. You took me too high, too fast. So I'm going to add in this chemical to please say, don't do this to me again. So that is when you have the big crash after a long TikTok scroll, or the crash after alcohol, the crash after junk food, crash after porn. When you actually feel extra crap, it's because of this dynorphin chemical is coming in to try and say, please stop doing this.
So I hadn't heard of Dynolphin before right now, so I'm immediately incredibly fascinated. And it is it's a deterrent. It's an inherent deterrent that we all have as human beings to not negatively or not reinforce negative behavioral patterns, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah,
And this
exactly
is
that, which is fascinating how clever this thing is that we're living in.
very much so. And I often talk about how I try to be not to the point of making life boring and analytical, but I try and be very analytical about the decisions I make on a day to day basis. And
Mhm.
we are what we consistently do, and the decisions I make in terms of I very rarely drink on a recreational basis now because I know it affects my sleep, I know it affects my
Mhm.
overall circadian rhythm, but I also know that there will be social occasions where I will enjoy having 12 beers. And what I do
It can
now
happen.
is I factor in the surroundings and the lifestyle decisions and the broader metrics around that rather than being so black and white about things because I can analyze how I feel either side of these.
Mhm.
And I know on a day-to-day basis, if I'm not drinking booze recreationally, then I will feel better. But I also know if I miss out on a social occasion, then and I don't buy in. I'll spend the whole day thinking, oh, I'll just be in this weird headspace. So what do? I look at it analytically, and then make informed decisions. But that informed decision comes from the analysis that I've made about previous decisions. So it's interesting to know
Mhm.
that there is an actual chemical that is accentuating that within my brain.
100%. And it's super interesting because I'm sure you've heard of the endorphins chemical before. That's the one that really is designed to reduce pain, physical pain, and also psychological pain within us. So, from a evolutionary perspective, the absolute core function of that chemical is if you were suddenly, I don't know, faced with fighting a bear or something. I mean, it'd have to be quite a small bear to have a chance, but if you were fighting a small bear and it scratched you, endorphins would release into your system in order to reduce the pain of that scratch so that you'd have a chance of surviving that situation. Similarly, if you're running away from an animal, it would release to reduce that pain. So whenever you're pushing yourself really hard and you're physically pushing yourself, endorphins are going to come in to reduce the pain you're going through. Endorphins very selectively is the opposite word to dynorphin. So endorphins are reducing pain within us. Dynorphins are adding pain to us. So they're kind of sisters guiding one another.
So it's fascinating, isn't it? Because I'm now reflecting. Alcohol seems to be the buzzword here, but if you're reflecting on a hangover, which is something the
Mhm.
majority of the UK
It's a
will
big topic.
have experienced, is you can often find that you lean into negative behavior patterns even when you don't feel as bad as you expected to because you are by definition hungover that day, and that's
Hmm.
potentially allowing dynorphin to beat you that day. But there might be
Hmm.
instances where it's right to work against it because obviously resetting that equilibrium is the priority when we are in that situation. So should we always take the lessons from dynorphin, or are there times where there are methods and things that we can do to try and reset and get ourselves back to equilibrium faster?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there's kind of two sides of dopamine. Dopamine will always return to baseline if it's left. If you do nothing, it will always come back on its own eventually, as long as you're not harming it further. So if it's really low, a waiting game will bring it back. So on a hangover, you could do nothing and eventually you'll come back. If you wanted to speed up the time in which dynorphin leaves the system and dopamine returns to baseline, it very simply follows a rule that if you do things that are effort, you're going to experience a reward of dopamine. That's the core function. It's just to make us put an effort to our life. So even if you take something as simple as cleaning your home, like you think, oh, I really need to clean the bathroom and the kitchen, or I need to redo my bedroom or my cupboard. These are things that are effort. But typically when you do them, it's like, oh, actually quite satisfying now I've done that. It's like that feeling of accomplishment. So on a hangover, the best thing you can possibly do is just do a few things that are a bit of effort, a bit of cleaning, a bit of movement, cooking yourself a good meal, something like that. Effort is going to basically get you back faster than doing nothing.
Interesting. Very interesting, because it's something that, again, without knowing the science behind it, I've intuitively sort of picked up on over the years that this is a better thing to do in this situation. Do this more, Fergus. And from a more relevant example at the moment is I'm in a bit of a slump, which I anticipated and have learned to experience. So post Keltman, which is the most recent podcast that I spoke about my reflections on, it
Yeah.
was almost a fortnight ago now, but I know there is this phenomenon of post-event depression, post-event slump, whatever you want to call it. I don't want to coin it as post-event depression because it's very temporary and it's you can anticipate it, but it's that culmination of hard work equals reward that comes to an end. And even though I know there's more on the horizon, I know that I've got plans for what's next. I'm straight back into a working day. I'm straight back into training. I'm straight back into eating habits. All these things. The previous thing that was such a fundamental component of my day-to-day life is now gone. So whilst that void has been filled, the reward has been received, and there's that slump that's come from that spike upwards. So for me, it's understanding what can I do in these post-event periods, which is always going to be improving. I'm always going to learn from. What are the habits and the things that I can do to try and bring myself back to the optimal position, away from that slump? And it's things like getting straight back into a positive training regime and having that mapped out beforehand. It's having all my food bought from the supermarket before I get back from the event, because I
Nice.
will just move away from. I'll just think, oh, you've worked hard, you've worked hard. Oh my god, a fortnight's passed and you haven't been to the shops. Just little things like this, and it's trying to get ahead of it. And I've picked up on that over time, but I am still, to be honest, coming out the back end of a little bit of a period of a slump. But I knew that was coming. So it's obviously it was a 15-hour race, so it was a very big day out for context for people that are listening. But it's the same effect in many ways, because it's the result of a prolonged period of effort, and that can manifest itself in people's day-to-day work, their work relationships, their family relationships, can't it? So it's a constant case of analyzing how you respond to certain things and then trying to better prepare as a result of the learnings from that for next time when those things come along. And from a scientific point of view, it sounds like you've just equipped me with all the information I need to better understand that, which is fantastic.
That is good. I think it is something important to recognize, because the process of dopamine, what's actually really interesting is we've always thought of it as just like a reward chemical, like we do something and then we feel good afterwards. In a lot of the more innovative research that's coming out now, the most pleasurable experience of dopamine is actually in the pursuit, not in the reward of the goal. So it's actually during the countdown, when you're really pushing yourself, and during all of the training up to it, that you're actually going to experience more of the high. And then when you hit that peak point of dopamine, that the dopamine's been there helping you with the pursuit, and it's like, oh, the system is done, I've managed to complete this. It is just going to think, finally, I can drop myself back lower towards baseline, just like the other side it wants to normally climb. And it is going to fall. So often, whether it's pushing yourself like physically and psychologically, of course, in that situation, or it could be, I even remember this, like working really hard for my A levels and having this big moment, like thinking, oh my God, it's going to be amazing when I finish. And then afterwards, almost crashing out a bit and thinking, like, where's this big reward feeling that I was expecting to come?
There's no
But
fireworks.
dopamine is,
What's this about?
I know. But often the most pleasurable experience is actually in the pursuit of the goal, which is, I think, quite a motivating factor. If you know that pleasure is in pursuit, I think it can motivate you to pursue what you're seeking for even harder, because you know that the joy is in there.